My parents tried to evict me from my land at dinner, said, "You own nothing here." So I smiled quietly because 3 weeks earlier I had done something they would never see coming, and the look on their faces when I finally revealed it would be worth every single second of suffering I had endured in that house. It started when my father called the family meeting, which is never a good sign in our household because those meetings only happen when someone is about to get blindsided, and this time I knew deep in my gut that someone was going to be me. My sister Rachel had been circling like a vulture for months, ever since she moved back home with her husband after their business failed, and suddenly she was whispering in corners with my parents and giving me these strange looks across the dinner table like she knew something I didn't. The property in question was technically in my grandmother's name until she passed 2 years ago, and according to her will it was supposed to be divided equally among her grandchildren, which meant me and Rachel, but my parents had always treated the land like it was theirs to manage and distribute however they wanted. I had been living in the small cottage on the eastern edge of the property for 6 years, paying rent to my parents, even though legally I probably didn't have to, but I wanted to keep the peace, and I had poured thousands of dollars into renovations, turning that run-down shack into something beautiful with my own hands. Every weekend, every spare dollar I had went into that place. Rachel never visited, never cared about the property, until suddenly she did, and I started noticing her and her husband Derek walking the land, taking measurements, having hushed phone conversations that would stop abruptly when I came near. Then came that Sunday dinner in late September, when the air was starting to turn cold, and my mother had made pot roast, which should have been comforting, but instead felt like a last meal. We were all sitting around the table, my parents at the heads, Rachel and Derek on one side, me alone on the other, and I could feel the tension crackling like electricity before anyone even spoke. My father cleared his throat in that authoritative way he does when he is about to make a pronouncement, and he said we needed to discuss the property situation, and my stomach dropped because I knew this was it. Rachel jumped in immediately, saying that she and Derek needed a fresh start, and they had been looking at the land, and they realized the cottage I was living in was actually the most valuable part of the property because of its location near the road and access to utilities, and wouldn't it make more sense for them to take over that portion since they were planning to start a family and I was just one person. I remember sitting there with my fork frozen halfway to my mouth, thinking, did I just hear that correctly? And my mother added that I had been living there quite comfortably for years, and maybe it was time for me to think about getting my own place somewhere else, building my own life instead of relying on family property. The word relying hit me like a slap, because I had been paying rent, I had been maintaining the place, I had invested everything I had into making it livable, while Rachel had been off living her life, never contributing a single dollar to the upkeep of any family property. I tried to speak, tried to argue, but my father held up his hand and said the decision had been made that Rachel and Derek would be taking over the cottage and the surrounding 5 acres within 60 days, and I needed to start making arrangements to move out. I felt the blood drain from my face, and I asked, what about grandmother's will, what about the equal division? And my father said the will was complicated, and they as executors had the right to interpret it in the way that made the most sense for the family as a whole, and right now that meant consolidating the property in a way that benefited everyone. Rachel had this smug little smile on her face, and she reached across the table like she was going to pat my hand in some condescending gesture of sympathy, and she said, "You own nothing here. This was never really yours. You've just been borrowing space." And something inside me snapped, but instead of exploding, instead of screaming, I just smiled. It was a small, quiet smile that made my mother frown and ask what was so funny, and I said nothing was funny, I was just thinking about how interesting the next few weeks were going to be, and then I excused myself from the table, leaving my pot roast untouched. What they didn't know, what none of them had any idea about, was that 3 weeks earlier I had received a certified letter from grandmother's estate attorney requesting that I come in for a private meeting. I had assumed it was just routine paperwork, maybe something about taxes, but when I sat down in that wood-paneled office, the attorney, Mrs. Chen, told me something that changed everything. She explained that my grandmother had actually updated her will 6 months before she died, and in that update she had made a very specific provision that my parents either didn't know about or had chosen to ignore. The property was supposed to be divided equally, yes, but grandmother had stipulated that I was to receive first choice of which portion I wanted, and that choice was to be made legally binding before any other distributions occurred. Apparently grandmother had sent a letter to my parents informing them of this change, but Mrs. Chen suspected they had never processed it properly, or had simply filed it away hoping it would be forgotten in the chaos after her death. Even more importantly, grandmother had placed the cottage and its surrounding 5 acres into a separate trust with me as the sole beneficiary, effective immediately upon her death, which meant that for 2 years I hadn't been renting for my parents at all. I had been living on my own property, and every rent check I had written to them had been legally unnecessary. Mrs. Chen showed me all the documentation, the updated will, the trust documents, the deed that had been recorded with the county showing me as the legal owner, and I sat there in shock, barely able to process what I was hearing. She asked if I wanted to notify my family right away, but something told me to wait to see how this played out, because I had a feeling that if Rachel and my parents thought they could push me around, they would show their true colors, and I wanted to see exactly how far they would go. So Mrs. Chan and I agreed that she would prepare all the necessary legal documents to assert my ownership, and we would hold off on serving them until I gave the word. I spent those 3 weeks watching Rachel measure my windows for new curtains, watching Derek walk the property line with a surveyor, watching my parents box up some of grandmother's things from the main house like they were erasing her memory, and with each day I felt more certain that I was making the right choice by waiting. After that horrible Sunday dinner, things escalated quickly because Rachel and Derek actually started making moving plans. They rented a storage unit, they gave notice at Derek's brother's place where they had been staying, and Rachel even posted on social media about their exciting new chapter on the family homestead with photos of my cottage that she must have taken when I was at work. My parents started pressuring me about moving dates, asking where I was planning to go, suggesting apartments in town that they had looked up online, and I just kept smiling and saying I was working on it, I would figure something out. 2 weeks after the dinner, my father handed me a formal eviction notice typed up on his personal letterhead, giving me 30 days to vacate the premises, and I took it calmly, folded it up, and put it in my pocket, and he looked almost disappointed that I wasn't fighting back. Rachel started coming by the cottage at odd hours, letting herself in with a key she must have gotten from my parents, walking through the rooms talking about which walls she wanted to paint, what furniture she would bring, and I would come home to find her there rearranging my things, and I never said a word, just watched her with that same quiet smile. The final confrontation happened exactly 30 days after that Sunday dinner at another family meeting, this time held in the main house living room with the explicit purpose of finalizing my move-out date. Rachel had brought Derek, my parents sat together on the sofa presenting a united front, and I sat in grandmother's old armchair, the one she used to read in every evening, and I felt her presence there like she was giving me strength. My father started by asking if I had found a place yet, and I said no, not yet, and he sighed heavily like I was being deliberately difficult, and my mother said they had tried to be patient, but enough was enough. Rachel and Derek needed to start their renovations, and I was holding everything up. Rachel chimed in saying she had been more than generous giving me all this time when legally they could have had me removed immediately, and Derek nodded along like a bobblehead and added that this was just business, nothing personal. I let them talk, let them lay out their plans for my cottage, their timeline, for gutting the kitchen I had installed, for replacing the bathroom I had retiled, for tearing out the garden beds I had built with my own hands, and when they finally stopped talking, when the room fell silent waiting for my response, I reached into my bag. I pulled out a large manila envelope and set it on the coffee table between us, and my father asked what that was, and I said it was something they should have paid more attention to 2 years ago. I opened the envelope and started laying out documents, the updated will, the trust paperwork, the recorded deed, all with official seals and stamps and county clerk signatures, and I watched their faces change as they started to understand what they were looking at. Mrs. Chen had prepared a letter summarizing everything in clear, simple language, and I read it aloud, explaining that grandmother had placed the cottage and 5 acres in an irrevocable trust with me as beneficiary, that the property had been legally mine since the day she died, that every rent check I had written had been unnecessary, that my parents had no legal authority to evict me, and that any attempt to do so would constitute harassment and illegal eviction. The room was so quiet I could hear the old grandfather clock ticking in the corner, and my father's face went from confused to red to almost purple as he snatched the papers from the table and started reading them himself, my mother looking over his shoulder with her hand over her mouth. Rachel stood up suddenly, knocking her chair backward, and she shouted that this couldn't be real, that grandmother would never do this, that I must have forged something or manipulated grandmother when she was sick, but I just pulled out my phone and showed them the email chain with Mrs. Chen, complete with timestamps from 3 weeks ago, showing that I had known about this for almost a month. Derek asked why I didn't say anything earlier, why I let them make all these plans, and I looked him straight in the eye and said, because I wanted to see how far you would go. I wanted to see if any of you would stop and think about what you were doing to me, if any of you would show even a shred of decency or love, but instead you measured my windows and posted photos online and handed me eviction notices for property that was never yours to take. My mother started crying, saying I had tricked them, that this was cruel, and I said no, what was cruel was sitting at that dinner table and being told, you own nothing here, when I had paid for every improvement to that cottage. What was cruel was my own sister planning to erase 6 years of my life and work. What was cruel was my own parents trying to steal my inheritance because they thought I was too weak or stupid to fight back. My father demanded to see the original documents, wanted to call his own lawyer, insisted this couldn't be legally binding, but I had already anticipated that, and I pulled out one more paper, a letter from the county clerk, confirming that the deed had been properly recorded, and that I was the legal owner of record with no liens, no disputes, no ambiguity whatsoever. I also mentioned that Mrs. Chen had advised me that I could potentially sue for the return of all the rent money I had paid over the past 2 years, since I had been unknowingly paying to live on my own property, and I could see my father doing the math in his head, calculating how much that would be. Rachel was pacing now, her hands in her hair, and she turned on my parents and screamed that they had promised her, that they had said this was all arranged, that they had assured her the property was theirs to distribute, and my father snapped back that he had thought it was, that he didn't know about any trust, that grandmother must have done this behind their backs. The blame started flying around the room, everyone turning on each other, and I just sat there in grandmother's chair, watching my family implode over their own greed. Finally I stood up and I said I would be staying in my cottage on my land, and they were no longer welcome there without my explicit invitation, that if Rachel or Derek or anyone else set foot on my property again, I would call the police and have them removed for trespassing. I gathered up all my documents except for one copy of the deed, which I left on the coffee table for them to stare at, and I walked toward the door, but before I left I turned back and I looked at Rachel and I said, "You were right about one thing. This was never really yours, but it was always mine." And the look on her face was worth every sleepless night, every anxious moment, every second of doubt I had experienced. My mother called after me, begging me to wait to talk about this, to work something out as a family, but I was done talking, done compromising, done being the one who bent and flexed and gave in for the sake of peace. I walked out of that house and drove back to my cottage, and for the first time in months I felt like I could breathe. Over the next few days I changed all my locks, installed security cameras around the property, and had Mrs. Chen send formal cease and desist letters to my parents and Rachel, informing them that any further attempts to claim or access my property would result in legal action. Rachel tried calling me 17 times that first week, leaving voicemails that ranged from angry to pleading to threatening, and I saved every single one as documentation. Derek sent me a long email trying to explain that they had made financial commitments based on what my parents had told them, and could I please consider some kind of arrangement, maybe they could rent part of the land or buy me out, and I didn't even respond because there was nothing to say to people who had been willing to throw me out onto the street for their own convenience. My mother showed up at my door 3 days later without calling ahead, and I watched her through the window, ringing the bell, knocking, calling my name, but I didn't answer, and eventually she left an envelope on my doorstep that contained a handwritten letter saying she didn't understand why grandmother had done this, that it felt like she was being punished from beyond the grave, that I was tearing the family apart, and I read that letter once, and then I burned it in my fireplace. The extended family started hearing about what happened through the grapevine, and my phone blew up with messages from aunts and uncles and cousins, all weighing in, all having opinions, and I responded to exactly none of them because this wasn't their business, and their sudden interest in family harmony was transparently about protecting my parents' reputation. Rachel made one final attempt about 6 weeks later, showing up with Derek at my property line, not crossing onto my land, but standing there calling for me, and when I finally came out onto the porch she said she was sorry, that she had been desperate and scared about their financial future, and she made bad choices, but we were still sisters, and couldn't we find a way past this? I looked at her standing there trying to look small and apologetic, and I remembered that smile on her face at the dinner table when she thought she had won, and I said, "You own nothing here. This was never yours," throwing her own words back at her, and I watched something die in her eyes before I turned and went back inside. My parents tried one more legal challenge, hiring their own attorney to contest the trust, but Mrs. Chen had done her work thoroughly, and the case was dismissed within weeks, with my parents ordered to pay court costs. After that the communication stopped completely, no more calls, no more letters, no more surprise visits, just silence, which was exactly what I wanted. I spent that fall and winter working on my cottage, making it even more mine, planting trees along the property line that would eventually grow into a natural barrier, replacing every piece of furniture that had any association with my family with things I chose myself. Some people might say I should have told them earlier, that I should have prevented them from making plans and wasting money, but those people don't understand what it feels like to sit at a table with your own family and hear them discuss erasing you like you're nothing, like your years of work and investment and love mean absolutely nothing compared to their convenience. I still live on my land in my cottage that sits on my 5 acres, and sometimes I see my parents' car drive slowly past on the main road, and I know they're looking at what they tried to take, wondering how it all went so wrong, and I don't feel guilty, I don't feel sad, I just feel satisfied that for once in my life I didn't let them steamroll me, that I stood up and I won. Rachel sent me a Christmas card that year, a generic one with no personal message, just her and Derek's names printed at the bottom, and I threw it away without a second.